Hi everyone, welcome to a brand new episode of the Behold podcast on the Genre Equality channel. I'm Hitzer,
Isa.
and we are here this week to talk about Western films. That's right.
Hmm.
One of the more, especially in modern times, underseen or underappreciated genres, although it did have its heyday back in the
Yep.
60s and the
Hmm.
70s, etc., with the Italian spaghetti westerns that Sergio Leone directed and stuff like that. But I'm here to talk about not just westerns, but specifically the malleability of the genre,
Hmm.
whereby we will be comparing and contrasting what I myself pick as the most classical example of Western macho revisionism,
Yeah.
which is in the Val Kilmer Kurt Russell film Tombstone. And we'll be contrasting that with other westerns that kind of subvert traditional Western tropes, such
Hmm.
as Unforgiven by Clint Eastwood, which kind of deals with the harsh realism of what it's like to be in the frontier, as well as the exploration of racist hatred against Native Americans in John Ford and John Wayne's The Searchers.
Hmm.
And finally, we'll be talking about this very mesmeric dissection of celebrity culture in the Western genre, which is, one of the oldest Americana genres there is.
Yeah.
In this case, we'll be talking about the Assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford, which is a more relatively recent Western, although that was in the mid 2000s as well.
Yeah.
Before we begin with our dissections of these four classic and subversive Western films, what are your thoughts on Western films in general? I know you're not like a super big fan of the genre, but
Yeah.
what are your like impressions of it?
I think growing up, especially like my exposure to westerns didn't like stem that particularly far, right? Like maybe like um Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, perhaps.
Of course,
And
yeah.
a couple like here and there. In general, I don't think I watch a lot of the classic westerns just because I don't think I had a lot of access to them. Generally
Okay,
speaking,
yeah.
yeah, how I was situated. I
Hmm.
have enjoyed a lot of the more modern westerns, I guess. Whatever the Coen Brothers have been bringing out,
Of course,
with
yeah. The Hateful
what was the
Eight,
last
the
one?
Ballad of Buster
Hateful.
Scruggs,
Yeah. So
Django
all of that,
Unchained. Yeah.
Django Unchained. Yes, and along the lines of what we got with the assassination of Jesse James. But yeah, not necessarily exposed to and therefore drawn to some of the more classic Western stuff. Like they come
Mm.
up fairly regularly, when in discourse, if we're talking about like, um let's say for example, adaptations of westerns in other media, right? Like Seven Samurai, for
Ah, yes.
example, and a lot of Kurosawa films with a lot of the Western themes within
Mm-hmm.
that, and how they're
Mm.
influenced by that. Or even like, is it called Unforgiven as well? Yeah, the Ken Watanabe remake of Unforgiven.
Mm. Yes, yes. What's very
Yeah.
interesting about westerns is the symbiotic relationship it has with samurai films. They are almost cut from
Hmm.
the same cloth, and they influence one another. I
Yep.
mean, most famously, the Seven Samurai was the basis for the Western adaptation, which was the Magnificent Seven. And ever since then,
Yep.
westerns and samurais have been almost interchangeable. I mean, the most recent season of The Mandalorian famously encompassed both aspects of samurai films and Western films. With
Yep.
the Ahsoka episode. Spoilers for people who haven't seen The Mandalorian. Sorry. Yeah.
I think, yeah, if you've been at home, social distancing and all of that, and you haven't got the Mandalorian, I think the statute of limitations has passed for spoilers. So,
Yeah. Who
uh,
in the world, right, hasn't caught The Mandalorian?
I mean, like, if you haven't, please go check it out. We've talked about it at length.
Mm-hmm.
Really, really love what they're doing there. But yeah, after hearing us talk about westerns and stuff like that, maybe you can go watch The Mandalorian if you haven't already and see thematically how that works out, or rewatch it. If you feel like you want to do that.
Absolutely. I mean, outside of the films that we're talking about here, you've already name dropped some. What are your favorite westerns of all time?
Ooh, I okay. I'm just gonna put Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid just because I watched that a lot. Like we had um the tape, right? Um
VHS. Yeah.
yeah, the VHS tape. For some reason, I don't know how it kind of got into our family collection, but it was there. So I watched that a number of times.
Yeah.
And obviously became very disenfranchised with the modern remake of it, which was very subjectively horrible.
Mm-hmm.
That was Ani. Was it Ani Hammer?
Mm-hmm.
Ani Hammer and Johnny Depp, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. So like I'm gonna put it at the top of my list. I do remember like a lot of Clint Eastwood stuff.
Yeah.
Not Unforgiven in particular, but I'm not sure what were the ones I watched because in my mind they were all the same movie. Like it's an
Mm-hmm.
amalgamation of every western that Clint Eastwood has ever done.
Yeah.
And it just kind of like melts into like this grand epic of this one particular guy
Mm-hmm.
who basically lived out in the Wild West. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I don't really have an expansive list for that necessarily.
Absolutely. Go
uh
ahead. Sorry.
are the four that we have on
Mm-hmm.
your top five list of westerns?
Um, they're in my top 10, certainly.
Okay.
But they're not in my top five. I picked this specifically because of the compare and contrasting.
Mm.
But if I had to pick, favorite westerns of all time, it had to be. I mean, you gotta mention the Sergio Leone spaghetti westerns.
Yeah.
The reason they were called spaghetti westerns was because they came at a decade where westerns were becoming out of fad in
Yeah.
Hollywood specifically. So what Sergio Leone did was to start filming in Italy instead, using Italian extras, actors, Italian sets, because it was
Hmm.
number one, cheaper, and number two, there was a great demand for westerns in Italy, so that's why they were called spaghetti westerns. It's
Yeah. Yeah.
nothing so much to do with the content, like, as much as where it's filmed. So the good and bad and the ugly. A fistful of dollars is up there as well. As
Yeah.
we're talking about, recently the more modern westerns, which are more subversive and more
Hmm.
revisionist. We already talked about mentioned Tarantino's Django Unchained, The Hateful Eight,
Yeah.
the Coen Brothers' The Ballad of Buster Scruggs. Most recently was really good as well.
Hmm.
But there are a lot of old films, like True Grit is one of my
Oh
favorites.
yeah.
Both the
Mm.
old and the new ones. The new True Grit, by the way, is also a Coen Brothers film. The Revenant is a new Western film
Oh
that was really
yeah.
really good as well. 310 to Yuma is excellent. And in terms of like guilty pleasures, there is this
Mhm.
really really stupid Western called The Wild Wild West with Will Smith. Do you remember that?
I love that. I actually, yeah, that definitely. Then yeah, that's definitely Western.
Like, I have
Um,
no idea why I like it. It's such a dumb movie, right? But for
yeah,
some reason,
absolutely.
maybe it's because we were like 7 or 8 when we watched it, but it just like hits me. It's so fun.
Yeah, I think a lot of it had to do with how culturally iconic Will Smith was at that point in time in his career.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And that just kind of bled over to his overall popularity. It kind of bled over into like hype for the movie itself.
Mm-hmm.
I remember watching it a couple of years ago. It hasn't aged well at all, but in
No,
my
yeah.
mind, I remember it being extremely entertaining at the very
Mm-hmm.
least.
Mm-hmm.
Um, what is? Ooh, okay. Shout out to Dances with Wolves, which was my mom's favorite western, and as such, I watched that a fair bit.
Yeah, Dances with Wolves. Who could
Dances with
forget?
Wolves. Yeah.
Yeah, AKA Avatar, lah. It's pretty much the same story, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Uh,
I mean, who was that? Who was that? Kevin Costner, right?
Kevin Costner. Yeah.
Yeah,
Uh,
what a legend. Yeah.
yep. Yep. Kevin Costner.
Yeah, I mean, those are just the films that come off the top of our heads, but there are a lot of classic westerns from the 30s, 40s, and 50s, of course, that we're not mentioning.
Hmm.
Although one of them we'll be talking about here, which is a classic one, The Searchers,
Yeah.
frequently recognized by many film critics as the greatest western of all time, or at least the most subversive western of all time. But
Mm.
let's begin
Yeah.
with one from the 1990s called Tombstone.
Mhm.
This was a bit of a classic. It's a story about Wyatt Earp, famous sheriff. It starred Kurt Russell. Many of the stars here are very well known for their mustaches,
Yeah.
which would
Which were all
the
real.
most
Which were all real.
which were all real. Yeah, yeah. Like one side note I wanted to bring up about Tombstone is right. Like everyone took time, like 4 to 5 months, to grow up those insane mustaches.
Yeah.
Um, they were incredible, and I love it so much. But yeah, this is a 1993 film. It was directed by George P. Costamos. Stars Kurt Russell, Val Kilmer, Sam Elliott, Bill Paxton, Powers Booth, Michael Bean,
Hmm.
and narrated by Robert Mitchum, who is the voice of westerns. It
Yeah.
begins in 1879 when the members of an outlaw gang known to wear red sashes. Not the Crips, they're called the Cowboys. They're led by Curly Bill Brocious. They are the big bads in the film, a gang. Wyatt Earp and his brothers come to town. They are retired police officers with notable reputations. Um, it's their job to basically come up against this gang and stop them. Val Kilmer also plays a legendary outlaw. He can be a Huckleberry. Doc Holliday, of
Yeah.
course. So these are all legends in the Western law, or the Western genre, or the Western myths,
Yeah.
shall we say? You
Hmm.
know, um, I don't know whether you've seen Tombstone back in the 90s, but it was quite a sensation back in the day as a big blockbuster Western
Yeah.
that came at a time when Westerns were not hip, were not hyped. What were did you ever watch Westerns back in the, did you ever watch Tombstone back in the day?
No.
Oh, okay. If not, then
Yeah.
what is your current impression of Tombstone?
Yeah.
The sheer coolness of it.
I mean, okay. So back in the 90s, I think the only Western that I did watch, interestingly enough, came out about the same time as Tombstone, and was like story was the same. It was the other Wyatt Earp one, which was Costner, if
Mm,
I'm not wrong. So I do remember seeing that. It's okay. Again, my mom's a big Costner fan, so
yeah.
we ended up watching that. But Tombstone, I mean, like, I can imagine why it was such a big deal, right? Like westerns, so much of it has to do with like the 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 kind of like myth of masculinity and kind of bravado and the machismo there. And
Mm-hmm.
in the cast itself, you kind of pretty much have the who's who of the 90s, right? When it came to like macho men. You got your Kurt Russell, your Val Kilmer, Sam Elliott, Bill Paxton, Powers Booth, Michael Bean, Billy Bob
Yeah.
Thornton, Billy
Yeah, in a
Zane.
small role, by the way, Billy Bob Thornton.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and like future kind of like men's men like Stephen Lang,
Yeah.
and then you got Ben Hur himself.
Yeah. Yeah.
Charlton Heston. Yeah, so I mean, like it's a long, long list of kind of like the who's who as far as machismo goes, and I can
Mm-hmm.
understand that, especially during the time that it came out, right, which was like 92, 93, I think.
Yep.
Kind of in the early 90s. These men were big stars, right, and some of them up and
Mm-hmm.
coming stars for sure. But like there is a sleekness and kind of polish to it that I think belies its time.
Mm-hmm.
It definitely stands out, I think, from any of the movies from the early kind of 90s.
Yes.
Just with the attention to detail as far as most of like the wardrobe and the setting goes.
Mm-hmm.
And that just like the famous like kind of group walkout scene, that's on the poster.
Mm.
Actually, is it on the poster? Yeah, it's on the poster.
It's
With
definitely a
the
poster. Yeah.
with the sleek black coats and shit like that.
Yeah.
Definitely high cool factor. um
Yeah.
as far as kind of like everything, how it was like even colored and all of that. It's a there are moments in time when it's a very, very beautiful film,
Mm-hmm.
especially in the quieter moments, which honestly I wish we had a bit more, because it does get fairly hectic.
Uh,
But
Actiony. Yeah.
yeah, we'll get to that, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
But like kind of initial impressions for that, I think Russell coming out and delivering, his macho one liners and
Mm-hmm.
his general kind of disdain for lesser men, And of course the very very iconic Val Kilmer as Doc Holliday, which I think is still one of the best performances out of a western ever,
Yeah.
and the most memorable, I think, for Tombstone itself. That stands out in my mind. I mean, I don't think Tombstone is a perfect movie. I have
No.
issues with the way that it, uh, with its pacing,
Mm-hmm.
and just like kind of the general thing. And to imagine like reading that it could have been much longer,
Yes.
had they not pared it down.
Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, so I think it was fun. I think I especially enjoyed maybe the first hour and a half, or
Mm.
so, and then just kind of past the hour 50 mark, I kind of like, it lost me a bit, because it
Mm-hmm.
wasn't as compelling from there on in when the action kicks up and it's all about the action itself.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but it was a fun ride. It was interesting, and I can definitely see why a lot of audiences were kind of enthralled with the film when it came out.
Absolutely. I mean, Tombstone of all the westerns, in my opinion, really symbolizes and embodies that the western genre was the original superhero genre.
Yeah.
A cast of larger than life characters, of good versus evil, of justice and revenge. Very classical themes,
Hmm.
big action set pieces at the end. These were people that you wanted to root for, very black and white. Val Kilmer as Doc Holliday, one of the most mesmeric and phenomenal performances of Val Kilmer's career.
Yeah.
He is always very compelling, and it's probably the most iconic portrayal of the famous gunman in cinematic history, and also
Hmm.
provides some subtle comedic relief.
Yeah.
He is just so fucking cool. I mean, Kurt Russell is the straight man, of course, here, but he's also really cool, and the film offers an incredible array of just like insane badass moments, from the moment where Kurt Russell comes to town, he meets up with, Billy Bob Thornton in the casino, and just like, slaps him. Are you just gonna stand there and bleed? It's one of the best lines I've ever seen. When he's confronted outside the casino later on in the film, the way that he takes the outlaw's gun from his holster and hits him with it over his nose, there's absolute badass moments. Val Kilmer coming out of the shadows. I'm your
Yeah.
Huckleberry. So many iconic lines, iconic moments. It's so cool. It's the biggest representation to me that westerns were the original American superhero genre before superheroes even came about.
Yeah.
Back in the 1800s, even there were books and comics about pulp fiction novels, about westerns, about the legendary outlaws. And they have been talked up so much, and so much myth has been built around them that they become so larger than life.
Hmm.
And this movie Tombstone really is the encapsulation of that larger than lifeness. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it's shamelessly entertaining, and absolutely absurd. Totally absurd in its execution. Totally a case of style over substance, but the style is so good.
Yeah.
But the reason I picked this first to talk about, because it is the most unrealistic and the most stylized western.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of what the western genre was building up to, to this point. Do you see?
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah, and any other thoughts about Tombstone before we move on to the other stuff that kind of subverts the tropes in Tombstone?
Well, I mean, it's based upon the whole idea, right? Like, the fact that these characters, right, existed in their own kind of mythos before the film was made, right? Like whole Aya Wired Up, legendary lawman, and then you have your gunman and all of that.
Hmm.
It's very much the way like the MCU works, right?
Yeah.
Essentially, the whole idea that there is a wealth of kind of backstory that is already known to some extent within popular culture, and
Hmm.
you want to flesh that out. You want to make it, well, personal, right, to the audience that are partaking in this like journey of people that they already know of and now get to know.
Mm.
And the myth making there is a fascinating kind of like idea that we only really explore later on in Assassination of Jesse James as well.
Yes.
But I
Yes.
mean, like, there are just like so many things. Like, for example, when Wyatt goes into the river and he miraculously like never gets shot,
Yeah.
despite the fact, right? Like, I remember watching that. And I was just like, that's a lot like kind of like Wonder Woman walking out into the no man's land, right?
Yep.
In Wonder Woman 1, and there are a lot of like very um pivotal moments within the film itself that you can pick out that could easily fit in any sort of like superhero genre to this day.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think it's a fascinating kind of way to kind of look at it. And I think as we've gone along, especially with like the other three movies that we're talking about, I think that changes significantly, because we
Yeah.
want to compare and contrast one. But even like um Western-esque films today, very few of them have the same kind of like cookie cutter
Uh-huh.
template that Tombstone set in stone right back then.
Mm, absolutely. Yeah, yeah, like if Tombstone was the MCU, Unforgiven is like the boys,
Yeah.
let's move on to Unforgiven right now. The Clint Eastwood classic. It
Yeah.
won him an Academy Award here. This was a great deconstruction of Western tropes. It's
Hmm.
an Academy Award winning Western, which is rare for that time period. It stars Clint Eastwood and Morgan Freeman, who are down on their luck outlaws who
Yeah.
pick up their guns one last time in order to collect a bounty offered by vengeful prostitutes in the remote town of Big Whiskey, Wyoming. What makes Unforgiven so special is that there is no element of coolness or machismo in it. It is
Oh yeah.
primarily concerned with deconstructing the morally black and white vision of the American West that has been established by traditional works in the genre.
Hmm.
The script is so saturated with unnerving reminders of the main character's own horrific past without necessarily showing it. Him as a murderer, him
Yeah.
as a gunfighter, so haunted by the lives he's taken. And the film as a whole reflects a kind of reverse image of the classical Western tropes. The protagonists are not, your avenging, God-fearing, innocent people who are hired. They are bad men who are murderers, and they want to collect a bounty for a group of prostitutes, right? In
Yeah.
the film, several men who claim to be fearless killers are either exposed to be cowards or weaklings or self-promoting liars, while others that no longer have it in them are forced to take another life. The portrayal of aging of someone past their prime in Clint Eastwood's case, or in other characters who just don't understand what it's like to take a life.
Hmm.
Even the beginning scenes where a prostitute is horribly mutilated in the face really goes to show that westerns are not this type of lifestyle
Yeah.
in the old west is harsh, is cruel, is brutal, and should not be sanitized like so many western films have, like Tombstone has, for
Yeah.
example. The morality here is gray, not black and white. There is no real justice going around. Everything about it is so poetic and brutal and realistic. Like the realism and the morality in conflict here is so great. What are the aspects of Unforgiven that stand out to you?
Um. Okay. I think like its main draw for me was a very in-depth but subtle approach to
Hmm.
understanding violence in a time when violence is currency.
Yeah.
And like how as currency it has its it is sometimes a means to an end, sometimes it's an end in and of itself, and how
Hmm.
that morality changes from person to person,
Yeah.
and changes within a person as well, as we see with Ned.
Hmm.
um and I found that extremely interesting, just the way in which that unfolds, as you get to know the characters and through their actions as well.
Yep.
Not much is said to address the idea of violence, right? Like it's very
Mm.
clear cut for the characters, but in the unfolding of that, it becomes a very kind of like in-depth look at a time in which violence was commonplace and widely accepted,
Hmm.
to be a part of the life that's there,
Yeah.
right? That was one of the big things for me. The other thing is, um, yeah, the whole idea of kind of like aging, right? Like what struck
Hmm.
me the most, I think, within the first couple of scenes, within the first half of the movie in particular, was just this moment when Money is struggling to get on his horse in front of his kids. right?
Yeah, that was so tough to watch, you know.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that was incredibly difficult, and I don't know if at the time it would have played for a laugh with for audiences watching it in the cinema, given Clint Eastwood's kind of like badassness in general and the character that he plays. But it felt
Mm-hmm.
like an incredibly sad moment to be privy to,
Yes.
as a man who is clearly past his prime,
Mm-hmm.
and in addition to that, past his prime as someone who carried violence along with him wherever he went.
Yeah.
But for him to just struggle to get on a horse, right, and that happens kind of like multiple times within the film
Mm-hmm.
as well. Kind of hit home a very subtle point that I didn't expect to feel for. And then of course, what's Gene Hackman's character's name? Little Bill. Little
The
Bill is
corrupt
kind of,
sheriff.
yeah, the
Yeah.
corrupt sheriff. With his whole kind of like um talking to the autobiographer about, like, kind of his heyday and all of his things, and his
Yeah.
relationship with English Bob. Is that his
Mm-hmm.
name? Yeah, English Bob,
Mm-hmm.
and what their relationship was like. m- Almost all the men that we see who are the main players within this film itself are men past their prime, who are either revel in their glory days, or their
Mm-hmm.
glory days are so gory that they
Ex-
have to they shun it actively, right? And
mm.
it feels like the film is searching for a resolution for these men, to come to
Mm-hmm.
terms with the violence in their past, whether or not they regard it as their glory days or not. um
Yeah.
yeah, so like there's so many kind of things that are folded into what is, I think, a very straightforward story,
Yeah.
uh as far as the kind of like how the plot is driven and all of that. But there's so much that takes place within the dialogue itself, so much that is referred to within the past of the characters that we never get to see on screen, that isn't really like
Mm.
kind of dealt with, that builds this world that feels much more um dire, right,
Mm-hmm.
than it's
Mm-hmm.
seen within the film itself, and that kind of like frames your understanding of what takes place in the story itself.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, I think the character that Richard Harris plays, English Bob, as you mentioned, who was a famous gunfighter back in his day, but now lives off the publicity and is followed everywhere by an autobiographer,
Yeah.
W. Beauchamp, who is a writer for pop Western magazines. He is the most interesting case study in the deconstruction of Western myths
Yeah.
in Unforgiven, I feel, because a lot of his stories, either, as you said, is living of past glory, or those glories were greatly exaggerated,
Hmm.
as they must have been, right? You look at Clint Eastwood's portrayal of money. It's so sad. He's no longer the man that he once was. The element of coolness is not there.
Yeah.
The dirt and the grime that you see everywhere, you just get a sense that it's so filthy, and it smells and it stinks.
Hmm.
Like, you don't really get that kind of aesthetic in many other westerns. The uh, Gene Hackman's character, the way that he talks about how myths are made around this type of people,
Yeah.
how he like pulls English Bob down a peg, even,
Yeah.
really just goes to show that maybe these men are not all they are cracked out to be, and maybe some of their stories are nothing more than myths, or at least exaggerated versions of the truth.
Hmm.
It's a very, very interesting. And one of the best characters in the film is also one of the younger ones, a character called Schofield Kid,
Yeah.
who is a kid who obviously grew up on the stories, who wants to be like this man. Basically, he was the coward Robert Ford before the coward Robert Ford.
Hmm.
He thinks that he has what it takes to be an outlaw, a gunslinger, a gunfighter, except he is nearsighted. He's not as skilled or as
Yeah.
badass as he thinks he is, and he doesn't know the real toll and moral cost and just emotional turmoil that comes with taking a life. And you see that when he makes his first kill, right? He shoots that guy in the toilet, right?
Yeah.
And he's just broken over it. Like, he doesn't understand what murder is until he does it. It's not like you read in the stories. It just isn't. It's a real thing that will fuck you up. And he was fucked up by this. I love all these little like portrayals and reversals of the Western tropes that
Yeah.
Unforgiven gives us. Do you have any other thoughts about Unforgiven?
Um. Okay, maybe just one.
Okay.
In kind of comparing and contrasting the women between Tombstone and Unforgiven.
Yeah, I forgot about this. Yes, good point.
Um.
Yeah.
Both movies were released basically back to back, right? Like, Unforgiven was in 1992, Tombstone
Mm-hmm.
was in 93. In Unforgiven we have the women centered on the prostitutes, right? Of
Yeah.
the saloon, and how they band together to kind of get and act their own justice
Mm-hmm.
for Delilah, who gets her face carved up. And
Mm-hmm.
like, just like within this clearly, patriarchal system in which they have, they are goods essentially, right? Like, her horrific trauma at the hands of her attacker is done away with the trade of horses. um
Yes.
and to many of them, that is an unacceptable thing, so they band together, put out a bounty on the two men, and then they go the in comparison to, um what's her name, Josephine in
Mm.
Tombstone,
Yep.
who I didn't understand that. I really didn't understand that.
Mm-hmm.
How does she like show up and all of a sudden is like the most liberated and enlightened woman of the 1800s? All
Because
of a
she's an
sudden.
actor.
Yeah, and I it completely befuddled me, just like how it didn't sit with the story.
Mm-hmm.
Like, at the one time you got this like slick western with all your heroes and your gunmen,
Mm-hmm.
and exacting revenge and justice for the common man, and for their friends and their loved ones and their family. And
Mm-hmm.
then strangely, you got Dana Delaney, who, very honestly, I think she did a great job. I just don't understand the character of Josephine Marcus as it was portrayed in Tombstone itself.
Absolutely.
And it feels so hollow, right? To have
Mm.
like kind of this grandstanding of, I guess, women's empowerment embodied within her character, as
Mm-hmm.
opposed to like actual working women banding
Mm-hmm.
together to get their own sense of justice, and seeing that actually take place, right? Like, there is
Mm.
some sort of closure within that, even though at much cost. um
Yeah.
you know
The way that Tombstone sort of glamorized Wyatt Earp's infidelity,
oh
to
yeah,
to just make the wife seem like this whiny, naggy drug addict, right?
yeah,
And then he's like, "Oh, so it's totally cool for you to just dump her out of the way
yeah.
and then get together with the actress woman."
Hmm.
And then the fucking movie ends with her saying, "It's okay, I'm rich."
Yeah. I,
It's
it
bizarre, right?
it is.
Uh, and,
Oh
and then the
man.
movie further goes on to say that Wyatt Earp actually, I mean, in real life, like in the early 1900s, became a consultant for Western films, for the early movie stars of the silent movie stars of the 1910s and 1920s, right?
Hmm. Yeah.
So Wyatt Earp is a bit like English Bob in a way that he's, propagating his own myths in
Yeah.
this new form of media, which is cinema. So yeah, yeah, like I totally get your point on that. Yeah.
Yeah. It just felt. I don't know. It really kind of rubbed me the wrong way. Like, I understand if you want to have a character like that, it just didn't. Right. Like, it
Yeah.
is. It is. It is part and parcel of the package of Tombstone. Right. Like, it has to have this
Hmm.
polish to it, whether or not it necessarily makes sense. Which it didn't. But
No. Yeah.
yeah, with all of that, whereas I much more sympathized and understood what was going on in Unforgiven, right? Like, that to me is understandable, and therefore I am more sympathetic and in support of
Hmm.
um the women in Unforgiven. And I
Hmm.
feel like it's more like kind of like justified. Like, the ending here makes sense in the
Hmm.
breadth of the story, as opposed to kind of the like riding off into the sunset nonsense that we got in Tombstone.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Like, I mean, Unforgiven ends with, albeit like a classic shootout, but at the same time a shootout that doesn't feel satisfying.
Yeah.
You have a character that is William Money, who has obviously turned over a new leaf. He regrets being the vicious killer that he was.
Mhm.
And the fact that he was driven back into it, at the end, like
Yeah.
the entire movie keeps talking about, what he was, how bad he was, how dark he was, and then you sort of have like this image built in your head. It's like, ooh, that's actually kind of cool. And then when he does go to the dark side, right, it's horrifying. It's not cool.
Yeah.
it's horrifying, like his descent into his darkness at the end is absolutely terrifying. And it's such a great memorable climax to Unforgiven,
Yeah.
in a movie that just step by step deconstructs all the little Western tropes,
Hmm.
all the morality tales and the easiness of revisionist Western, whereas this is more of a realistic Westerner. So great, I think this is uh one of the best Westerns ever made, in
Yep.
my opinion.
Hmm.
And certainly, I think even in Clint Eastwood's great overall of Western cinematography,
Yeah.
this is his best.
Hmm.
Undoubtedly, lah. One of the finest classical westerns to come along, perhaps since 1956's The Searchers, which was directed by John Ford, starring John Wayne. The Searchers is a classic western from 1956. It follows an American Civil War veteran who embarks on a journey to rescue his niece, who has been kidnapped by Comanches. Yeah, this movie is very, very subversive for its time. Think
Yep.
about it, like it's in the 1950s, right?
Hmm.
And the movie kind of starts out a bit stereotypically. You got a good guy, the American Civil War veteran from the South, mind you, who comes back home, has this like nice little family, and then like his family is attacked by indigenous people, and his niece is kidnapped, so you kind of root for him to get her back, right?
Hmm.
But as the movie goes along, you start to see cracks in our hero's facade. Like he is not the white meat hero that we think he is.
No.
Like, but perhaps he is after the Native Americans for more malicious reasons. Perhaps it's for racial reasons. And the more obsessed he gets with revenge, the more obsessed he gets with punishing the Native Americans, the more you start to turn against him, the
Hmm.
more you start to see what a hateful man he is, and the more you start to sympathize with the Comanches and with the indigenous peoples of America in general.
Yep.
This was one of the most compelling Western characters ever made, and one of the most compelling Westerns ever, also, simply because the hero, your white John Wayne, ends up, for all intents and purposes, thematically, as the villain of the film.
Hmm.
What do you think about The Searchers?
Ooh. Um. There's something about the scale of it, uh,
Yeah,
that really caught me. This entire journey, that Ethan Edwards takes together with Marty,
yeah.
uh, it feels grand, right? A lot of the scenic shots in particular, it makes it feel like a very long, kind of arduous journey, that underlays perhaps what you as an audience hope to be the character's journey, but then you
Mm-hmm.
realize that no, stuck, and he's really, really kind of stuck at that.
Mm-hmm.
It and his entire kind of obsession, right?
Mm-hmm.
You start to question it at certain points in time. What drives this man, and why is it that he is as obsessed with this chase as he has been
Mm-hmm.
for throughout the entire period. Um, yeah, yeah. It took me a while to get into it. I think like it's been a long while since I've watched something that classic.
Mm.
With all like the way that it's told, and the cinematography and all of that. It took a bit of getting used to, for sure. It felt strange because there were just moments in time where a lot of the very good moments of comic relief juxtaposed against this brooding man who's always kind of like in frame in the background or something along those lines, right? Just like felt very odd,
Mm.
and very sinister. And
Yeah.
as everything kind of goes along, and more things are revealed, and you start to notice things, and you've got like some hit canon going on in your head, you start to kind of understand why these things are. It's definitely a lot easier, I think, by the midpoint of the show
Mm-hmm.
to sympathize with the Comanches, and what they're doing, because every single thing that they do, they
Mm-hmm.
are given motivation for, and
Yes.
it's completely understandable between like two hostile groups of people, right? Like some
Yep.
of them are tactical, some of them are strategic, some of them are practical. and
Mm.
all of those things are completely understandable. But Ethan Edwards is a mystery of a man, because so much of the time you don't know what his true motivations are. You can
Mhm.
see the hate and the vitriol, and the general his general disgust, um
Mm.
um with the Indians, right?
Yeah.
And that is clear, but you don't get a good sense of why that is, or why is it like um his growing kind of like uh burning purpose in order to find his niece
Mhm.
becomes as dangerous as it becomes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. He is Ethan Edwards is a bit like I will compare him to maybe like a taxi driver, Travis Bickle, right?
Oh yeah. Hmm.
He is so he's a bit of an enigma, fueled by a kind of hatred and self. It's both self-loathing and loathing.
Hmm.
He is confused about the world. He doesn't understand it.
Yeah.
He is seeking to lash out, and it manifests through his obsession and through his bigotry. He is a stark and lonely man, lah.
Yeah.
And I think that the film really portrays him very well in that light, and of course, like a major theme of the film is the historical attitudes of white settlers towards Native Americans or
Yep.
indigenous peoples.
Hmm.
I think John Ford was not the first to attempt this examination cinematically, but his depiction of white people's harshness towards Native Americans was particularly startling, especially for its time,
Hmm.
for a generation that was unused to seeing white men or white people as the villains of a film.
Yeah.
He portrayed the Comanches as not savages. As you mentioned, they all have motivations.
Yeah.
They all are just people who are trying to get their land back. I think at the heart of the searches, is this John Wayne's performance as angry and vengeful Ethan Edwards. And from the beginning of this quest, he is quite clearly less interested in rescuing Debbie
Yeah.
than in wreaking vengeance on the Comanches.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
And that's his true motivations. Like traditionally, your Comanches or the Apaches are portrayed or depicted as utterly ruthless.
Hmm.
Whereas Ford ascribes motivations for their actions and lends them dignity befitting a proud civilization. They're
Yeah.
not savages.
Hmm.
Never do we see Indians commit atrocities more appalling than those perpetrated by the white men. I think Wayne is a bit like like an Ahab character, kind of, like going after his white will, not understanding what it is.
Yeah.
And he's kind of driven into madness past limits, because of his vengeance and his bigotry lah. And it's so great to see in a film from the 50s. Like I never did expect to see something like this, because when I watched the searches, I was very young. My dad was a big John Wayne fan.
Yeah.
So I watched the searches with him, like not fully understanding the subtext until much later on.
Hmm.
Uh, yeah. I mean, what do you think about the film like this coming out in the 50s, and how do you think the audiences would have reacted to it? Would they have understood what the film was trying to say?
I'm not sure if
Yeah.
they necessarily would. I think like definitely the more keyed in members of the audience would definitely have seen that turn.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's easy to let it go, right?
Mm-hmm.
The story itself gives enough reason for you to
Root for Ethan, right?
to root for Ethan for the majority of the
Mm-hmm.
movie. And I
Yep.
think like if I was in that position, for me that the turning point is they when he starts shooting at the bison,
Yeah.
um um in the snow, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
just I want to deprive them of their food, is what he is thinking, right? And at which point I think like you can no longer ignore the fact that this guy is past the point of sanity, right? And
Mm-hmm.
is pure. He's been entirely consumed with the idea of enacting violence upon the other,
Yeah.
with no real reason there. Um, and yeah, so I'm not sure necessarily. I mean, I don't think I've read up enough to see what the response was to the searches itself.
Mm-hmm.
But it is definitely a really, really intentional
Mm.
um turn to have taken with the character, as opposed to something that just ended up being that way. And I'm hoping that most of the audience took that.
Absolutely.
It's hard to imagine that it sat very well with many audiences in the 50s.
It's white audiences, lah. Yeah.
White audiences, yeah, in the 50s.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I could easily see the searches being in the 50s. Like, okay, for example, you know how like when we were young in our teens, a lot of our male friends identified with the toxic masculinity as seen in Fight Club, not
Yeah,
understanding that Fight Club was a satire of it, or a mockery of it.
yeah.
Like we thought it was cool, right? Because we
Hmm.
just didn't know any better. Or a more recent example is that the majority of Breaking Bad fans just can't seem to wrap their heads around the fact that Walter White is a bad guy.
Yeah,
You know, although the series clearly in its fucking title calls him a bad guy.
yeah,
you know his descent into like egocentrism and villainy is clearly portrayed there and shown you there. The fucker like bombed the nursing home. A kid died because of him. He poisoned a child, and people are still rooting for him. Like, I mean, perhaps that is down to the complexity of his character, which I do agree is he's a very complex character and very well written lah.
hmm,
But it's quite clear that he's meant to be the bad guy, and just people just kind of keep like can't wrap their heads around it. In much the same way that I think a lot of white audiences till this day still can't wrap their heads around John Wayne being the bad guy of this.
yeah,
The classic Western cowboy being the villain, and the actual victims of him were the quote unquote savages, the Comanches. Like, I don't think that it still sinks in.
hmm,
And as much as like John Wayne tried or John Ford tried in this film, I think a lot of the early reception of this was just like, oh, this was a cool classic film, um, portraying like a man driven to madness because his family was slaughtered, etc., etc. Like, not understanding, that he was actually motivated by bigotry, not necessarily by tragedy. Yeah, I mean, it was a very interesting film to have been made in that particular time.
yeah,
And I think it stands the test of time, and it continues to be called one of the best Western films of all time because of that, lah.
hmm,
But I hope if you do go out and seek the searches, like you do kind of try to understand the subtext beyond the very obvious text. It's not just a revenge film; it's a film about racism.
yeah, yeah. And I mean, like, it's a film about racism. It's a film about miscegenation.
Yes,
It's a
yeah,
film
yeah.
about women's place in society, right? Like, whether or not Debbie, who at that point in time has become an adult woman, her wishes aren't respected.
Mm-hmm.
None of that like matters at all. The fact that he goes from searching for her to wanting to kill her because she's become the wife of a Comanche war chief is,
Yep.
like, it's, yeah, it is more about his sense of honor and his sense of, like, what is right, through the lens of his bigotry than anything else, right? Everything else just pales in comparison, um to that. So yeah,
Absolutely,
I mean, there's
absolutely.
so many things to kind of unpack. Yeah, and again, like you said, 1950s, like, pretty groundbreaking stuff.
Oh yeah, 100%. Let's move on to our final topic of this episode. It is the movie that started my love affair with long titles. This is the Assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford. In 2007, this was an epic western, written and directed by Andrew Dominic. It was actually adapted from Ron Hansen's 1983 novel of the same name. The film dramatizes the relationship between legendary outlaw Jesse James, played by Brad Pitt here,
Yes.
alongside, shall we say, his fanboy, Robert Ford, played by Cassie Affleck. And it
Hmm.
focuses on the events that lead up to the titular killing.
Yeah.
The assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford is unusual in a sense because, okay, just aesthetically and tonally,
Hmm.
um, yes, there is gunplay, but this is actually a wondrously contemplative, almost poetic saga, that is very bewitching and deliberate and really like revels in the majestic beauty that is the American landscape, or the American West landscape back in the day, and its meditative style, I think, did it no favors in gaining popularity or gaining box office dollars.
Yeah.
because I think that it's very art house pacing, and it's
Hmm.
very meditative style, made it quote unquote less exciting lah,
Yeah.
to the casual audience. But I loved it for that reason. I mean, we before we even get into the talking about celebrity culture and all of that, what do you think about the Assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford as a film, and what do you think about its tone and pacing?
I loved it. I loved it.
Hmm.
It's just something about it's okay. uh Assassination is definitely like more my speed in terms of like what I generally enjoy from movies and all that. And then on top of that, right, you take on this very unique take on what a western should be, right? So you have all the myth making and all the mythos like surrounding these great men
Yeah,
on either side of the law, and you meld it into this like very somber, uh like you said, contemplative, very, very deliberate look at the inner lives of these men,
yeah.
that I find like it's a winning combination for me. Very honestly, out of all the movies that we're talking about, this is definitely my favorite and the one that I've watched the most.
Hmm.
But I do recognize that a lot of that has to do with the fact that it is in line with what my own personal aesthetic preferences are.
Yeah.
Um, as well, and the fact that of course it is one of the most modern film on our list today.
Hmm.
But it's just the fantastic performances by both Brad Pitt and Casey Affleck, skin crawling at times, completely unnerving, coupled
Hmm.
with Roger Deakins' amazing camera work, and with the all the sorts of like techniques that he brings to the table to kind of like put you off guard, especially like with the soft edges and the transitional shots and things like that, that
Hmm.
really kind of like sunk in a fascinating story about a man, about two men grappling with, um, you know, one with his own mythos and the other with a mythos that he has subscribed to for the longest time.
Hmm.
Uh, in many ways, this is Western Black Swan. Uh,
Yeah.
uh,
Western Perfect Blue, which
or
was
Western Perfect Blue, yeah,
which was the basis of Black Swan.
yeah,
Yeah,
which was basically a
same
Black
thing.
Swan.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and it is incredible to watch and partake of as an audience member, because there are just so much that you can milk out of a particular scene, of a particular line, of a particular look.
Hmm.
And Brad Pitt, I think in particular, has this incredible gravitas as Jesse James, as a man who is slowly falling apart,
Yep.
despite the fact that he can't afford to fall apart.
Mm.
I love it. And Casey Affleck, like straight on, all out creepo douchebag.
Yeah.
Like he plays it to a T. And I
Hmm.
understand like whatever hate his character gets is completely warranted because he plays it so well. You know.
Absolutely. He is the 1800 celebrity stalker, I mean,
Yeah.
he's a clout chaser, he is an Instagram influencer, you know what I mean? He is just that for that period. I think like this m- absolutely mesmerizing, very haunting retelling of this legendary outlaw's downfall
Mhm.
is rather than a celebration of, the traditional masculinity of the classical Western,
Yep.
is actually a perceptive deconstruction of the flawed masculinity via the dual character studies about
Mhm.
two very complex and very troubled individuals, especially in the beginning of the or the Western genre. The outlaw was thought of as, the American anti-hero, the classic American anti-hero,
Yeah.
beginning as early as the American frontier back in the 1800s. And it's documented in sensationalized literature, and often romanticized, right, in modern American folklore.
Mhm.
In a sense, the outlaw in the Wild West was one of the first iterations of celebrity in America. And Robert Ford's troubling fixation with the outlaw Jesse James was one of the first instances of celebrity obsession in the long pattern of American history of celebrity obsession. In fact, it is predominantly in pop culture a celebrity obsessed culture,
Yeah.
and it was great in that way. it's the movie is about so much more than a murder, than the murder of Jesse James. It's I
Hmm.
think it's a testimony to Andrew Dominic's sharp writing and luminous direction, as well as Roger Deakins's cinematography.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, as a quick aside, this was the first time I've ever noticed Roger Deakins back in 2007. Like, I didn't
Yeah.
know who he was. When this movie came out, I made a point to know who he was. Very
Oh
impressive. The
yeah.
cast, the cinematography, the directing, and the writing were all amazing. It doesn't ever feel predictable, despite you knowing what's going to happen because it's in the title.
Yeah.
Like Jesse James in himself, was a thief and a murderer, like many times murderer. He's a mass murderer, but he fascinated people all around the world in much the same way that our tabloid culture or internet culture romanticizes like bad boys or bad girls.
Yeah.
Like those who think about the fascination with serial killers, for example, or OJ Simpson, or stuff like that. That modern phenomenon is not so modern. It's been around
No.
for a couple hundred years now.
Hmm.
And who better to play someone who fascinates the masses, right? Like, than a leading man like Brad Pitt,
Oh yeah.
who possesses the ideal charismatic and enigmatic qualities essential for the part of Jesse James. Cassie Affleck, though, here is kind of the younger brother of Ben Affleck, is the real revelation here, though. I think this is first breakout role that first made people notice him.
Hmm.
And his presence is felt here. He plays someone quirky, but at the same time there's something like really off about him that you're
Oh
a bit
yeah.
scared by,
Hmm.
and he perfectly inhabits the role of the needy, ambitious, clout chasing Robert Ford, a manipulator who idolizes Jesse James and yearns to be his sidekick, uh, to the point where he eventually manages to kill the outlaw who eluded capture for so long. Um, but what Ford himself didn't bargain for is the aftermath of his act of violence.
Yeah.
The film examines the concept of celebrity from all angles because okay, Jesse James kind of targeted wealthy owners of railroads and banks. He and his gang had a sort of Robin Hood reputation with the public,
Hmm.
and his death only intensified his fame. At the same time, Robert Ford ended up becoming to give a Hamilton like allegory. He's like your Aaron Burr, right?
Yeah.
He became the villain of the story in to public knowledge, and that's the other side of him as well. I think like the psychological underpinnings and the sociological aspects of it is what really carries the assassination of Jesse James more like it elevates it from just a very pretty, very poetic western to a profound western. Yeah,
Yeah. Absolutely.
yeah. And any other thoughts on the film?
Uh no, I think we've kind of covered that, right? Like I'm hoping for more in this vein, you know.
Mm-hmm,
I don't think like we've gotten that much of I don't know. What would we call this? Art house westerns, I guess.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Together with what other films could possibly No Country for Old Men,
Absolutely. Yeah,
There Will Be Blood,
yeah.
to some extent like Django Unchained, I think as well.
Mm-hmm,
Falls into this kind of like category in which like enough time has passed since the creation of the genre of the Western genre,
mm-hmm,
and enough kind of like iterations of that and subversions of that and revisions of that have taken place now, where we are in a place in which there is ample space for anyone to take on the genre in their own um, vision of
yeah.
what it should be and what it can be.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I'm kind of super fascinated by that as well. I think Clint Eastwood is returning to Western. He's
Yeah.
doing a Western
He'll
this year, right?
he'll never get away from it. Till the day he dies, he'll be in a western.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah,
Yeah.
so I'm super interested to see how he's going to do that, because I think he's changed significantly as a director.
Mm-hmm.
Over the years, with all the other things that he's done, and I'm super curious as to how he's going to tackle um one of the first few genres he ever tackled in his
Mm-hmm.
youth. Yeah, and I think like the Coen brothers will always have a deep fondness for the Western genre, and well, we might be seeing more things out of him as well. Yeah, and
Yeah,
any absolutely.
yeah. If you wanna get an account of the birth of celebrity culture in America, you can't go further than the Assassination of Jesse James, because it really covers one of the first few celebrity heroes, or
Yeah.
folk heroes of American culture in Jesse James. And if you want to talk about the birth of toxic fandom, Robert Ford is that guy. He is your toxic fan right there.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
When you talk about toxic fandom, right? You can point to Robert Ford as one of the originators back in the 1800s of toxic fandom. Something that has come to the forefront in recent years. Yeah. And those were the four westerns that we talked about this week. It's firstly, Tombstone, your classical machismo western, and
Yeah.
then you talk about the cruel harshness, the dirt and the grime and the realism of Unforgiven by Clint Eastwood. Then we talked about the racism and bigotry prevalent among white settlers against Native Americans in John Ford's The Searchers. And finally, we talk about a more recent Western, which is The Assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford. All of them available on Blu-rays and DVDs and various streaming services out there.
Yep.
So we highly recommend that you check them out. Um, we picked out like very obvious westerns here. There are no like neo westerns. If you're wondering what a neo western is, it's more like a modernized western like the Hell or High Water, for example, is a
Yeah.
neo western.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
For sure.
So we didn't talk about neo westerns. Although they are like a subgenre within this genre, I wanted to talk about westerns in general.
Hmm.
I think for a compare and contrast purposes, I think these four films really showcased how subversive the latter three were, as opposed to the tropey stereotypical the first one was. And there's nothing wrong with the tropiness of the first one, by the way. It's just
Yeah.
fucking cool,
You don't get subversion if you don't get the tropes ahead of time. Like it doesn't like work that way. You have to establish that before you can subvert it. So it's important in its own right.
Mm. It's Tombstone was like your Avengers film, of like the superhero shots, the slow walks, the
Yeah.
fire in the background,
Yeah.
like that's what westerns originated. To be honest, lah. And if you're not a fan of the genre, we urge to check out these four films alongside the many other films that we name dropped in the beginning.
Yeah.
We will be back in a couple of weeks' time
Hmm.
for genre equality. We got lots to talk about, particularly our main topic will be the Suicide Squad. Not the David Ayers one. This one has the in front of it. It's
Yeah.
the Suicide Squad.
Yeah. James Gunn's.
It's
Hmm.
James Gunn's Suicide Squad. It's essentially a reboot slash sequel. We'll,
Yeah.
we'll, we'll, we'll we'll talk about that lah.
Yeah.
It's a
We will.
complicated. I don't really know what to call it, but we'll talk about the Suicide Squad, which regardless of its canon implications, is very fun. We'll talk about the latest season of Rick and Morty, Legends
Hmm.
of Tomorrow, Tuca and Bertie. I'll be talking about a couple of films that just came out. Free Guy, for example, Jungle Cruise just came out. Old M Night Shyamalan's latest film.
Hmm.
I'll be previewing The Green Knight, which I've already gotten to see. It'll be released in Singapore on September the 23rd, but I'll be reviewing that ahead of time. And Isa will be dropping his latest anime corner.
Yep.
Lots to talk about there, including the latest Witcher property, which is The Witcher Nightmare of the Wolf,
Yep.
which will be dropping on Netflix a week from this recording time.
Yeah. Super
So
excited.
we'll talk about that when we see that. What were you most excited to check out?
Definitely Witcher. For sure. I mean, like there are a couple other things that just came out as well that we won't be talking about on this month's thing, like the new Star Wars anime. It looks really, really good.
Yeah,
Uh,
comes out next month. Yeah.
and like in the midst of all of that, like the What If series on Disney Plus right now, the Marvel What If series also looks extremely good.
Yeah.
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 So a lot of stuff. Yeah, happy to share some choice anime picks, not as bountiful as last time round as I've complained about before. But
Mm,
that's okay. You can't have it good all the time. But yeah,
yeah.
I'm pretty excited to see what the month has to offer for us.
Definitely, we will be back next month for genre equality, and of course like a bunch of other topics as well.
Hmm.
If you haven't checked it out, I recently wrote and we'll be talking about Dune in depth in a couple of months. But I
Yeah.
recently wrote an essay about
Oh
Frank
yeah.
Herbert's Dune, and how I mean, to give you a bit of background, I spent the last couple of weeks reading Isaac Asimov's Foundation novels.
Oh, very
Uh,
nice.
which made me realize that Dune was kind of Foundation fanfic in a way, because
Yeah,
he
yeah,
he created his own world for sure, but the
yeah.
situations were exactly the same
Uh-huh.
thematically, except that Frank Herbert drew opposite conclusions from Isaac Asimov.
Yes.
And then I found an essay that Frank Herbert wrote back in the 70s where he outright admits that he was a big fan of the Foundation novels but
Yeah.
disagrees with Isaac Asimov's conclusions.
Uh-huh.
So he wanted to make his own mythology to like refute Isaac Asimov's Foundation novels. So they were both like, it's both an inspired by and a counterpoint to Isaac
Yeah.
Asimov's Foundation.
Yeah.
The reason I wrote about both and how Frank Herbert was inspired by Isaac Asimov is because Foundation, of course, will be an Apple TV Plus series
Mm-hmm.
next month, coming out on Apple TV Plus, of course, and Dune will be coming out in October. So it's just a nice coincidence that these two book series that were so intertwined thematically happen to be coming out within 1 month of each other, lah. And I would highly recommend you read the books as well,
Oh yeah.
because I mean, I'm sure like the series and the movie will be good, lah, but there's just nothing like for original books.
Yeah. Yeah. I
Yeah,
can't wait to
yeah.
dive
So
in. I can't wait to dive into our Dune episode. Especially
absolutely.
the news that the second movie is going to be helmed by Zendaya instead. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Super
Yeah.
interesting.
So very interesting. Yeah. So if you want to read my essay, it's available on potwire.com.sg. I recently posted it on the Genre Equality Facebook page as
Yeah.
well. So yeah, go check that out. Anything you want to plug before we get out of here?
Yeah, speaking of things that we've done recently that you might have missed, we would like to remind you, if you haven't checked it out already, that Asian Nightmares episode 1 is up and about, titled The Water Corridor, written by our great friend Christopher Falk, and
Mm,
featuring Leanne Sutton, also a good friend of ours. You can check
yeah.
that out on Spotify. Just search for Asian Nightmares. You can find it on the Bandcamp and all of that. We'll be pasting the links and all of that for you guys to go check out. Please go support. If you're a big fan of horror and horror stories, in particular, Asian horror stories or things based in Southeast Asian folklore, please
Hmm.
do check that out. There will be more episodes coming soon, and we hope to we will let you guys know as and when they come out. But yeah, please do check that out and show some support.
Awesome. Yeah. I mean, Asian horror stories as well as Genre Equality and Behold, all available on Spotify, YouTube, Mixcloud, wherever you find your podcasts, you can
Hmm.
find us.
Yeah,
So go check us out and give us a like, follow, and subscribe. Till then, this has been Hit Zero.
I'm myself.
Goodbye, guys.